We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Beis in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 37b. On the previous someone, the Gemara said that if a person sells a field to somebody else, but he retains for himself some of the trees, even if it's just one or two trees, he is going to retain for himself as well the land around those trees. And the reason is because when it comes to trees, to come kachshi biyara, trees are different than, let's say, a pit or a cistern, because the trees can weaken the land, and so therefore shiurei shara, he's certainly leaving himself some of the land surrounding those trees. The ilo shire, because if he doesn't leave for himself some of that land, lay malay, what's going to happen is that the person who owns land is going to say to him, akor ilona vizil, uproot your trees and you should go. And the Rashbam explains the kamekachshi, because again the trees, they weaken the land, meaning hasharoshim bekarka, the roots, they go into the land and weaken the land. Vegam ma'akvenes hamachresh, also having the trees holds back the person from being able to plow because there are trees in the way. So vadai asik adaite l'shayir liatzmo karka svivos ilano. So therefore, for sure, the seller thinks to himself, I'm going to leave myself some of the land that surrounds these trees. Kadei shelo yuchal halokech la'ar olav. That way, the buyer won't be able to protest against him. V'lomar k'sheyav ilanosav. He won't be able to say to him when the trees dry out, Akori lo nascha, you should uproot your trees, Shekol vazil, and get out of here, to Hamazki la'aroi, because they're damaging my land. And so that's why the seller does retain for himself some of that land that surrounds the trees. And the Gemara continues, Machar ilanos v'shayir karka lefanav. Now, let's say a person would sell the trees and leave for himself some of the land, so that's already pluksud Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbanan. That's going to be a machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. Again, Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan are arguing whether a person sells generously or not. Rabbi Akiva da'amar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. According to Rabbi Akiva, who says that the seller does sell generously, so then islay, so then we're going to say in this case where he's selling the trees, but he is going to sell generously, the person will be entitled to that surrounding land as well. L'Rabbanan lesle, but according to the Rabbanan, he does not sell generously, and therefore the buyer will not be entitled to the land. And the Rashbam over here explains, Machar ilanos v'shayir karka lefanav, a person sells the trees, but he leaves the land for himself, meaning, Shapirish lo kain ha'ilanos ani mocher lach. He says, I'm selling you the trees, v'hakarka ani ma'akev liatzmi, and I'm keeping the land for myself. So that's a pluksud Rabbi Akiva v'Rabbanan. That will be a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan, bein l'Rav Zvid, bein l'Rav Papa, whether we're following Rav Zvid or Rav Papa. This is talking about Rav Zvid and Rav Papa in the previous summit. Rav Zvid and Rav Papa on the previous summit, they were talking about a situation where you have two buyers, and one of the buyers is buying all of the trees on the land, the other buyer is buying the land. So Rav Zvid said that that in that case, the person who's buying the trees gets only trees, and the person who's buying the land essentially gets all of the land. Rav Papa said, no, you're going to say that the person buying the trees is entitled to some of the land as well. The Gemara will go on and mention Rav Zvid and Rav Papa in a moment, but the point is, the Rashbam is saying, it doesn't matter whether you follow Rav Zvid or Rav Papa in this particular case, where we're talking about one buyer, and the buyer is buying the trees and the seller is keeping land. Uvishnei ilanos ma'iri, the Rashbam now explains, we're talking here specifically where you sell two trees. Now, if he's selling three trees or more, then automatically the buyer gets land. That wouldn't even be a question. So the case over here is two trees, the vishloshi ilanos hakol modim tekana karka, by three trees, everybody agrees that the buyer gets land. Kedetanan stama b'hamocher sasvina, like we learn in the Mishnah later on. Umakmin la b'gemar Rabbi Akiva umiu reisha dekatani gav shnaim ein lo karka lav Rabbi Akiva kedamukach b'shili hamocher sabayis v'asam parshina la. Later on, we'll explain the sugya in that context. But the point is, again, over here by two trees. So again, he's selling the trees, but the seller is leaving himself the land. So that's already a question. And we're going to say it's a machlokus Rabbi Akiva and the Rabban. And Rabbi Akiva damar mocher ba'in yafa mocher islay lelokach mokom ilanos al hakarka. Point over here is that according to Rabbi Akiva, who says the seller sells generously, so the buyer is going to get some of the area surrounding the trees. He'll get that land. Lita acher b'mekom kashiyamu. So for example, let's say to plant other trees, let's say when these trees die. But l'Rabbanan ein lo karka, according to Rabbanan, no, he has the trees and only the trees. He has no land. V'im yamusu, and if the trees die, lo yita acher b'mekoman, he's not allowed to plant others in their place. So that's what the Gemara is saying over here, that this is going to be a machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan. According to Rabbi Akiva, the buyer will have the rights to some of the land. According to the Rabbanan, he will not. And the Gemara now elaborates. Rabbi Akiva islay. According to Rabbi Akiva, the buyer gets some land. Va'afilu l'Rav Zvid. Now, even according to Rav Zvid, where we were talking again about two buyers, where we say the person who bought just the trees is going to only get the trees and no land. Even according to Rav Zvid, Amar Einlo, who says the buyer doesn't get any land, Hani mili gabe shnei lekuchos. That's only true when we're talking about two buyers. Again, you're talking about two buyers on one piece of property. One's getting the land, one's getting the trees. Because he says to him, Leslie B. Lonos, the person buying the land, says to the person buying the trees, just like I don't have any rights to any of your trees at all, you also don't have any rights to any of the land. That's exactly how we're doing this purchase. So that's true over there. But over here, where we're talking about one buyer, mocher, buying yafa mocher, the person who sells, he sells generously, and so therefore he is giving some land to the buyer. And the Rabbanan Leslie, the Gemara continues to explain, according to the Rabbanan, the buyer doesn't get any land. V'yafilu the Rav Papa, even according to Rav Papa, in the case of the two buyers, where we say the person buying the trees does get some land, Amar Yeshlo, who says the buyer does get some land, Hani miligabe shnei lekuchos, again, that would only be true by two buyers. There you have a different logic according to Rav Papa, the Amar Le, because he can say to him, meaning to say the person who is buying the trees can say to the person buying the land, just like to you it was a generous sale, to me also was a generous sale, that's why I am entitled to some of the land. Aval hacha, but over here, we would say according to the Rabbanan, meaning over here, according to the Rabbanan, where there's one buyer, mocher be'ein ra mocher. The general rule according to the Rabbanan is the seller is selling, but he's not selling generously, and therefore he's not giving any of the land to the buyer. And the Rashbam explains within Rav Papa the logic is gabe shnei lekuchos diamar, when you have two buyers, so then the Baal Ho'ilono says lebal karka, he says to the owner of the karka, ki hechid delididach zavin be'ein yafa, just like the sale to you is generous. What that means is as follows. What he's selling to you from the land, because remember, according to Rav Papa, it's not so generous in the sense that the buyer of the land gets all the land, because on the contrary, the whole point of this argument is that the buyer of the trees is getting some of the land. But that part of the land which is being sold to you, you're going to get that forever, and you're going to get that together with the produce. So then the buyer of the trees says the same is true for me. I'm buying also, and the seller is being generous, meaning I get the fruits of my tree forever, meaning that if they die, I'm going to be able to have the right to plant other ones. Because according to Rav Papa, a person's not going to sell to one of the buyers generously and to the other not generously. But again, but over here, when we're talking about one buyer, where he's actually withholding for himself the land, meaning to say the seller is selling the trees and giving and retaining the land for himself, it's not going to someone else. There already, the person is going to be be'ein ra, it's going to be not generous, and therefore the buyer of the trees is not going to get any land. And the Gemara continues, they say in Nahardoi, Ochlan Ritzufin, if we're talking about an orchard that is overcrowded, that's how the Rashbam will explain Ritzufin. So then when it comes to Chezkas Gimel Shanim, the Gemara here is returning to the issue of Chezkas Gimel Shanim, making a chazaka for 3 years, Ein lo chazaka. So if the orchard is overcrowded, you can't make a chazaka because that's not the normal way to work an orchard, so it doesn't count for a Chezkas Gimel Shanim. Ma'azkiv lo Rava asks on that, but according to that, Haimesha das past, if you have an alfalfa field, b'mai kani la, how are you going to acquire that? That's also crowded. So Elo my Rava, rather Rava says, if you're going to explain this idea at all about Ritzufin, it's talking not about Chezkas Gimel Shanim, but rather about Kenyonim. It means to say Machar and Ritzufin, if he sells him in overcrowded, a field that has trees which is overcrowded, so then Ein lo karka, he's not entitled to any of the land, even though normally along with the tree you will get the land as well. That is not true in a situation where it is Ritzufin. And the Rashbam explains, Achlan Ritzufin, if he consumes them Ritzufin, meaning Lahani Shloshim Ilanos, meaning the 30 trees we were talking about in the previous daf, Kagon Shenetuim Tezvav Bebeisa, let's say they're planted a little too many in the Beisa, more than normal, Ein a Chazaka, so that's not considered a Chazaka. Let's say 15 of the trees in a Beisa, it's not a Chazaka. Ve'afilu Achlan Kulan Kol Shaloshanim, even if he's consuming from all of them for all 3 years, so he's getting produce from all of the trees for all of the 3 years, it should be a full Chazaka in a general case, but here it's not because it's overcrowded. He's not making a chazaka like the normal fashion. Because the trees that he's working, those aren't going to last. He's going to need to uproot those trees. Rava asked on that, according to that, if you're going to say that because of the way they're planted, it's not a chazaka. So let's say you have this alfalfa, a field of alfalfa, how are you going to acquire that? That's very crowded. Nevertheless, we say there is a concept of chazaka there. There's a concept of chazak in that case. And the Rashbam continues, Umiu lavaskafta mal yosahi. The Rashbam notes this really is not a good question, meaning this question of Rava from the case of aspasta is not really a strong question. Because by the aspasta, that's the normal way that it grows. So what kind of question is that? One weakens the land, one doesn't. It's different kinds of produce. Just Rava happens to be, he doesn't hold of this logic just because it's overcrowded, therefore you don't make a cheskas gimel shanim. So he's just asking any question he can ask, but really he just means to say he doesn't hold of it. The Rashbam does offer a slightly different interpretation of Ritzufin. V'yesh l'farish, some explain, Achlan Ritzufin ein chazaka shesofan l'sharesh osan u'lefazer netiyasin. If they're Ritzufin, the reason why it's not a chazak is not really because it's not the normal way, but it's because you're going to uproot them. It's going to end up being scattered. Shekain derech ilonos l'ntoa harbe tchila b'yachad, because the way it is by orchards is you plant a lot of trees at first, v'yachar shegadol, then after they grow, mefazer osan, you scatter them a little. Hilkach lo have chazaka hoel u'lesharesh kaimi. Therefore, it's not a chazaka because it's something that's meant to be uprooted. Ve'enzu ikar gidulan. This is not the main area where they are going to grow. And the Rashbam continues, Elo Amar Rava, rather Rava says, Islam l'meimar midi b'ritzufin. If you're going to say any halacha by ritzufin, hachi amrin, and the halacha should be as follows. And now we say that we're not talking about chezkas gimel shanim, but we're talking about a kinyonim on an overcrowded orchard. Machar and sufin ein lo karka. If he sells a ritzufin, again overcrowded, so he's not going to get the land with the trees, even though normally you would. Kigon shenatu and yoser miyud bebeisa. Again, you have more than 10 planted in a beisa. There we're going to say he doesn't get land. Here we don't apply the general rule that when you buy 3 trees, you get the land together with them. That's not true if it's overcrowded. This is not considered a standard orchard. Because again, it's an orchard where these trees are going to be uprooted. That will be what happens to them. And therefore, again, you're not going to acquire the land as you normally would in a regular case. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Zeira says, Kitanoi, let us say that this is a machlokas tanoim in terms of this case of Ritzufin where it's overcrowded. Kerem shunatu al pachos me'arba amos. Let's say you have a vineyard and it's planted on less than 4 amos. Again, essentially it's overcrowded. Rabbi Shimon Omer Eino Kerem. Rabbi Shimon says that's not called a vineyard in terms of the halachas of kilayim. That's what we're talking about over here. The Chachamim Omer Harezu Kerem. The Chacham say no, even though it's overcrowded, it still has the status of a vineyard in terms of the halachas of kilayim. V'roen esoim tzim ki'ilu einan, and we just view those middle trees as if they're not there. And the Rashbam explains, Al pachos midalet amos, it's on less than 4 amos, she'in bein shura l'shura l'gimel amos, meaning you only have 3 amos between each row. That's the case. Eino kerem, that's not considered a vineyard. V'hamevi zera l'sham, if somebody brings other seed over there, eino loka, it's not going to get malchus b'shum lo sizra karmecha kilayim. It's not going to be an issue of violating the prohibition of kilayim, umutar b'achila. You'll be able to eat it. It won't be prohibited like kilayim. So that's the first opinion, but the chachamim say ho'im tzo'im. We look at the middle, meaning shura bein shtei shuros, that middle row and ki'ilu eina, we look at it like it's not there. V'havelhu sheish amos bein shura l'shura, we view it as if it's a proper vineyard in terms of the halachas of kilayim. And the Rashbam continues, Uli el nami, so in the case earlier as well, we say the same kind of machlokas, gabi machor ritzufin, in the case where you sell it, but it's overcrowded. So again, there's a question, in that situation, do we say you acquire the land or not? It's going to be a machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan roen esoim sim ki'ilu einon. According to the Rabbanan, we view the middle ones like they're not there. V'dinan kimifuzar, it's like a normal scattered orchard. V'gabe mocher tzufin yesh lo karka, so he will be able to acquire the land when he buys it in this fashion. Rabbi Shimon ein lo karka. According to Rabbi Shimon, we'll say he doesn't get land because it's going to be considered overcrowded. V'hainu kitanai, that's what we mean to say that this issue is really machlokas tanoim. The milsa de Rava tanoihi. The point is that what Rava said is actually machlokas tanoim, and it only follows Rabbi Shimon. It follows Rabbi Shimon. Udelo Rabbanan does not follow the Rabbanan, meaning according to Rabbi Shimon. So we're going to say ein lo karka. He's not going to get land because it's overcrowded. And again, that's exactly what Rava said. Rava said as well, machor nitzufin ein lo karka. And the Gemara continues, Amri Nahardoi, they say Nahardoi, Hai mind the Zovin Dikla Lechavre. If somebody sells a palm tree to his friend, Koni le Mishipule ad Tohoma, so he acquires all the land beneath the tree all the way until the depths. And the Rashbam explains, Mishipula ad Tahoma, Shulyav Metargamin and Shipoloi Kilomar, Kol HaKarka means to say, all of the land, Beshule Ho'ilan, if you acquire this tree, all of the land that's underneath that tree, Dahainu Sfas HaKarka at Tahom Shel Karka, going all the way down, you're going to get that land. And the point over here is as follows. Sha'ava b'shadekel yechidihu. The point is, even though he only sold one tree, so it wasn't 3 trees where you automatically get the land, Utanan dafilu be'ezein lo karka, the halacha is 2 trees also you don't get land, so 1 you certainly shouldn't get land. But hani mili sevivos, that's true if it's sevivos ha'ilan hudein lo klum. You don't get the surrounding land. That's what we mean when we say that if you buy a tree, you don't get the land. K'moshiyesh legimel, because let's say, for example, by 3 trees, you get the surrounding land. You get beinein v'chutz lehen k'moli or v'salo. You get between them and surrounding them according to the area that you need to work the tree. Aval ta'achtav de'ilan, but under the tree, miyo islay. The point over here is that you do get right under the tree. Tekevan de'ilan lepeiros of kona, since he's acquiring the tree for its fruits. Leskayim mikar kazu gam im yomos ha'ilan yita acher b'makomo. The idea is that if this one should die, he can plant another one. We're also teaching that the owner of the field can't dig under the tree. Even if he's 1,000 amos below, he can't dig below that tree because the person who owns the tree owns the land that is below. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph.